Well, I am pleased to be joined by Dr. Daudi Abe, the man, the myth, the legend. My also just a great brother of mine. My name is Marcus Harrison Green. For those who don't know, I am the editor and publisher of the South Seattle Emerald, that you can read at seattleemerald.org, and also a columnist for the Seattle Times. But I gotta say that it is a special treat to be joined by you today, Dr. Abe. Man, your book, Emerald Street. Um, just a history of hip hop is very much a history of also a dual history of Black Seattle, I will say. And I can't tell you in terms of somebody who was actually born and raised here and is proud to be from here, like Seattle until I'm on my back, I say. I mean, it was just such a love letter to the Black community as well, and not just some saccharine love letter, but I mean in the sense of like of the multidimensionality and the nuance of it, and you don't leave anything, you don't bury your hand in the sand about anything. It was just such a it's raw and uncompromising, but at the same time compassionate, empathetic, and just real and authentic, and just such a brilliant work. So I just want to start there. Um, but
Well,
I
that
know.
means a lot. I have to say that means a lot coming from someone as yourself, and I think that your description of a love letter is absolutely right. I mean, this book is the intersection, at least for me personally, of two of the things that I love most and have had the greatest impact on my life and kind of helping me become the person I've become, and that's hip hop in the city of Seattle. And so the cross of those two things is absolutely, something that's near and dear to my heart all around.
Well, man, I know the intersection is in full display in this book. I do, since this is our first sort of recorded virtual book talk for Third Place Books, Seward Park. We call it an audible today. Um, but I also thought this is also the first time that we had an author of a book and an author of a book of this level of work and craftsmanship, who was here to speak upon their work today. And so I want to start off by asking you to, if you're willing to, if you could um, read a passage from the book that you think really, encapsulates this work.
Well, so I would like to read a couple of passages that, in my opinion, speak to the duality of the Black experience in Seattle. And so the first one is from chapter one, and that's titled Seattle, the CD, and the Arrival of Hip Hop. And it's actually on page 12. And it's talking about African American settlers who came to the Seattle area in the second half of the 19th century. Don't laugh at how far away I have to hold this book to see the words. All right. African American settlers who first came to Seattle in the mid 19th century were drawn by the region's free air, meaning the absence of the most blatant policies and practices of racial discrimination that were a part of everyday life for Black people in the southern United States. African American men, for example, routinely participated in civic life in Seattle at a time when voting prohibitions and terrorist tactics drove post Reconstruction era African Americans away from the polls in other regions of the country. Black men in Washington voted throughout the territorial period, and the Washington Territorial Suffrage Act of 1883 briefly made it possible for Black women to cast ballots until that law was struck down by the Territorial Supreme Court in 1887. Although it would be incorrect to claim that racism and discrimination in the Pacific Northwest was never an issue, those dynamics certainly look different in Seattle than they did in other parts of the United States. And so that's just kind of highlighting, like I said, uh, this place has a very kind of self-congratulatory attitude and reputation about racial progressiveness. And some of that is deserved by, that highlight that I just read right there, because you're talking about Black men and Black women voting in the Washington Territory in the 1880s.
Right.
I mean, that's still an issue for people now, never mind 100 and some odd years ago. Okay. So there's that end. And then there's the other end here. And this is the first paragraph from the conclusion, which is titled Back When Empire Way Became MLK. On January 20, 1966, Reverend John H. Adams of First AME Church told the advisory committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission hearing, quote, Seattle is one of the few cities left in America which can solve its racial problem before it becomes unsolvable, end quote. In this statement, Adams spoke for numerous Black, Latino, Native, Asian, and white residents who, quote, still summon the courage to believe in a peaceful racial future for the city and the nation, end quote, wrote Dr. Quintard Taylor in The Forging of a Black Community. But that optimism has yet to be fully justified. Over ensuing decades, racial tensions have been further inflamed by such issues as police misconduct, educational inequities, and increasing gentrification. Taylor concluded, quote, indeed, Seattle's apparent success and its underlying failure in its race relations paradigm has been its meticulously crafted image, which promoted the illusion of inclusion, end quote.
Mhm.
And I think that that's so powerful because, like I said, if you're talking about the fact that Black men and women were voting in the 1880s, yes, that is fantastic, just in terms of comparatively speaking about what Black people were able to do as far as the ballot in other parts of the country. But on the other hand, the illusion of inclusion is something that points to the fact, like, for instance, that both the Seattle Police Department and Seattle Public Schools have, in the last 10 years, been under federal investigation for how they have conducted business, specifically with regards to African American people. That's what I mean about the duality of the Black experience here. And that doesn't necessarily, that just, those examples are not the last word, certainly, but they're just a good example, I think, about the back and forth that exists between, yes, racial progressiveness on one hand, but yes, also issues around race that are not so progressive, and you find them all around the country.
Interestingly enough, the article, excuse me, the passage, the last passage that you read about inclusion, if you carry it on and continue it to the next sentence, right, and it says essentially that hip hop is inclusion, right, and so as somebody who is essentially a lifelong Seattleite, and knowing that the city has a duality to it, if you will, right? It has this sort of progressive reputation, not always necessarily progressive practices. You have people who it has this creative community here that per capita is probably probably rivals many other places. But then you also have, again, as you talk about in the book, there's a passage about the low self-esteem that some of the people have here. So as in reading your book too, I was wondering, I was thankful for it because as somebody who, I think it's what 52% of people who currently live in Seattle aren't actually from here, right? They didn't originate from here, and
Starting
have
to be
only
like Vegas.
right, exactly. Not as fun, right? But I mean,
Right.
but so can you talk about the need really for this book in terms of not just shining a light of what Seattle was, but what the legacy that it really has for people that is still accessible, if you will.
I think that the idea of the low self-esteem is it's it's something that this area has struggled with, but it's almost like, we have so much to be proud. We have so much to have high esteem about. There's been a
Right.
lot of and a variety of areas and artistic kind of uh, you know venues and not just hip hop. The book goes into kind of the history of kind of Black music before hip hop and that kind of thing. But you know, I think that the necessity of it is kind of this. I don't want to say it's the same thing as Africatown and what White King is doing, but it's in the same vein. White King is obviously doing something on a much broader scale where he's acquiring land and
Right.
making
You're talking
sure,
about Viking gear
right, and there, right, White King Garrett with Africatown and making sure that there's a physical presence, but also I think this book complements work like that, just in terms of highlighting the wide range, and especially because it's not only been about rap. It's been about pushing all the four original elements of hip hop, which is MCing, DJing, graffiti, and breaking. And so that kind of celebration of the multiculturalness of hip hop, and like you said about that sentence after the one I quoted in the conclusion about hip hop actually being about real inclusion, not the illusion, but actually real inclusion. Because you cannot talk about the history of hip hop, at least here. I don't know about other places, but at least here, without talking about the history of the Black community.
Right.
But the fact that it originated from the African American experience has never been a point of exclusion within hip hop culture. Hip hop culture has always been, first of all, rap music has always been about talking about who you are and what it's like where you're from. But then hip hop, in a larger sense, and I think KRS-One said this, what has been always less about ethnicity and more about authenticity,
Yes.
uh, ideology, and skill. And so if you have those things and you're good, and you're actually good, and in hip hop, it's hard to deny. I mean, you could be a hater in hip hop, but a lot of times when it's because it's built on competition and built on a response of the crowd, you might be the only one saying, "Oh, that guy's whack," but if the rest of the crowd was like, "Oh, that guy's filthy," then what are you really going to say? And so the kind of the meritocracy that exists in hip hop in a lot of ways, at least in the early hip hop. I'm not sure if it necessarily exists today because of social media and algorithms and strategies that people can use to get ahead. Maybe that has always existed within the industry, even if it wasn't social media per se. But I think that the importance of it is just to make sure that there is a documented history. And I also have to say that there's a reason why I called this book A History of Hip Hop. You know what I mean? I'm not arrogant enough to think that I can fit 40 years of history into 200 some odd pages of text of writing.
I'll say I did
Um,
want to keep reading, so you could is volume two on the way or what?
I'll say that no, volume two is not on the way. But I will say that I purposely called it a history because it could never be the history, at least not in
Mm,
this many pages. And because I think that there could be a book written on Seattle breaking all by itself.
right.
If you have the largeness and success of a group like Massive Monkeys, not only do you have what they've accomplished, which is two world breaking championships, one in 2004 in London, England, and the other in 2012 in Seoul, South Korea.
Right.
Not only do you have them, but you have everybody that came before them, like Fever One, who I went to middle school with in the freaking Coleman building, that's now the African American Museum. You have
Right.
someone like him who graduates, moves to New York, becomes a member of Rock Steady Crew. I mean, if anybody knows anything about hip hop history, you know that Rock Steady Crew is like, what I'm saying, the Alvin Ailey dance company of hip hop. It's like
Right.
top shelf, the most historic, the most well known, world famous, all of that. He comes back here. He doesn't just rest on his laurels. He comes back here and starts tutoring people at Jefferson.
Right.
So now you have a member of Rocksteady working with young people at Jefferson, and that's where he meets Jerome Ski, and that's kind of where Massive Monkey is formed and everything like that. And so I think that is just such an excellent community representation of so many stories, some that are in the book and some that are not, that
Right.
really speak to the level of reaching back that the hip hop community has. That, like I said, I don't know how it is in every local area, but I can't imagine that there's too many more scenes that have communities that are as focused on reaching back and pulling next generations of young people up along as we have here in Seattle.
And speaking of that, because I thought it was is very interesting that, I mean, if obviously, nationwide, people always joke that, all you have is two rappers from Seattle, essentially Macklemore or Mix-A-Lot, and yet, right, just even in the first 30 pages of your book, before we even meet really Sir Mix-A-Lot, or I think he maybe is in there in the first 30, but because he obviously writes the forward of the book, but it's just so much of just the realization that there's so much of Seattle's DNA in hip hop culture, whether it was Mecca that had one of his founders, excuse me, two of his founders were from here, and so many other things, whether it's Julie C, whether it's Satisfaction and so forth, and yet, right, there's not you wouldn't necessarily say, and you touch on this in the book, that there's necessarily a Seattle sound, if you will, right? Like there is in New York, like there is in Los Angeles, like there is down south. And yet, right, but there is sort of this common thread through all of the acts that have emerged from hip hop here, is that they're not afraid to be themselves and showcase their own individuality, right? Like Sir Mix-A-Lot, as you quote Charles Medede saying, the stranger writer Charles Medede saying, Sir Mix-A-Lot raps like Sir Mix-A-Lot, Macklemore raps like Macklemore.
Mhm.
What is it about this area of Seattle that allows sort of that creativity to be birthed and created and spawned here?
Well, so there's a portion in chapter one that talks about the geographic isolation of this area, and it has long been speculated that the fact that we're so, when I do a presentation about this, I show a map of the United States and I talk a little bit about, okay, so let's think about the different corners of the country. If we were to point out what the, not the actual capital, but like the cultural capital, the different corners of the country. So like the Northeast is probably going to be New York City. And like the Southeast, maybe Atlanta or Miami, maybe one of those, the Southwest, Los Angeles. But there's no question that the capital of the Northwest part of the country is Seattle. And not only that, but all of those places that I just named have relatively large metropolitan areas relatively close to them. Um, Whereas Seattle, okay, no disrespect to Portland. Well, anytime you say no disrespect, guess what's about to happen?
It's about to be some respect.
Yeah. So,
Disrespect.
so no disrespect to Portland, but you know what I'm saying? Traveling south, the next biggest city you get to is the San Francisco Bay Area. And that's like almost 1,000 miles away, 800, 900 miles away. Traveling east, the next biggest city you get to is Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is
Right,
like 1,500 miles away.
right,
So even though in that whole big swath of part of the country that I'm talking about, there may not be necessarily huge population centers, there are consumers of culture at every point along the way. And those young people look to Seattle as the capital for our sports teams, for our newspapers, I'm saying, for stuff like cultural stuff like glass art, and also for urban culture. And so there may not be another city in the country that, just in terms of square mileage, has the reach, the cultural reach that Seattle
absolutely. So I'll say this too. For somebody again who is here growing up and born and raised, like seeing you sort of really bring some of these people to life on the page that are literally like the White Kings of the world, or the Julie C's of the world, where it's like, man, I could go to the station coffee house in Beacon Hill and see them today.
has.
um
Yep, yep.
what what was that like in terms of capturing um many in the activist community here in Seattle, and sort of their relation with hip hop as they were back in the days of the Coleman school occupation to occupy Seattle to today?
It's like I said, I think that the simple existence of hip hop is activism, I would say. The simple fact that it's here, because hip hop is really not even supposed to be here. If you think about where it came from and who was authoring it, what I'm saying, and whose voice was being amplified, it's really not even supposed to be here. And I do have to say that it's uh, so I teach a hip hop class at Seattle Central. I have been for almost 20 years now. But one of the things that it's a little bit difficult for young people, and it's through no fault of their own, it's just when they were born. I mean? Most people who take the class are late teens, early 20s, and they have no memory of anything but hip hop being the most mainstream of the mainstream. But it's a little bit difficult for a lot of young people to really wrap their heads around the idea that there was a time in the 1980s where it was like, where kids like me who were like latching onto it as kind of our first identifiable music kind of cultural movement that we felt like spoke directly to us about the longevity of it.
Mm.
Because we had just seen in the 1970s one of the biggest uh, musical genres of that decade, disco, disappear almost overnight once it came to the 80s. And there was no guarantee that that wasn't going to happen with hip hop. Like I said, it sounds crazy to young people now because it's so entrenched and you could
Yeah.
never think that that would happen. But that was certainly something that I was worried about.
Well, I
I
gotta
was,
say, maybe it's my taste, but I'm glad one survived over the other. But anyway, continue, please.
I mean,
No, playing, playing.
that was something because there was no guarantee. There was no, it was like, man, I mean, it was still young. It was still experimental. It was still people trying to figure out exactly what it was and how far it could go and would go. And
Mm.
once it starts getting more popular, people like me, I guess, got a little bit defensive about like, oh, now people want to be down. You know what I'm saying? That, I'm saying, we was down from the beginning. Now, you get to the later 80s and now, oh, people saw, the freaking Run DMC video with Aerosmith. Oh, now all these people want to be down. So there was a little bit of that defensiveness, but as I said, the simple existence of hip hop and where it came from and what it came from was a form of kind of activism. And so, speaking to people who have been in the midst of it, like Julie C, like Gabriel Teodros, like King Chasm, I mean, who has built an entire organization, 206 Zulu, around working these principles through education, through activism, based on Africa Bambaata's original uh, Universal Zulu Nation model, about doing all of that through a hip hop lens. And I think that the interesting and kind of crucial part of the discussion around the question that you're asking in activism is that this form of activism, because it was linked with a specific culture, because it was linked with a specific vibe, because it was linked with a specific group of people, had a different flavor to it, I think, than many other kind of activist generations that came before. I think many other activist generations that came before maybe found commonality within just the activism, but I think that the combination with this generation of finding commonality around activism and hip hop
Mm.
added to the kind of totality of the activist experience.
So then, I mean, is it safe to say that, I shouldn't say safe to say, fair to say that hip hop really is the music of the revolution, if you will? Or is that, do you think that's overstating things a bit?
No, I don't think there's any question. I mean, I think that it's been watered down just in terms of like, you know, if you were to ask me what the turning point for that was, I would probably point to the release of the NWA album Niggas for Life in 1991. I want to say that was, or 92. It was after Ice Cube had left the group. And the reason I point to that is because it
Right, and I
was,
do remember his song afterwards. That was I won't
yeah,
repeat the title, but
right,
it was definitely
right.
critical of NWA.
Right, but it was right. But it was musically it was a great album, but lyrically it was just like so over the top, just unnecessarily caricature over the top. I mean, there was a skit on that album called "To Kill a Hooker," where it was an audio of these guys actually acting like they snatched a woman off the street and shoot her in the back of the car. So it's foul. I mean, it's foul on a lot of levels. But I point to that album because it made number one on the Billboard Pop chart. It
Mm.
displaced Paula Abdul from the number one spot. And so if you have any memory of what Paula Abdul was back in that time, Paula Abdul was Taylor Swift back in that
Right,
time.
yeah, no, my dad was a
You know
huge
what I
fan.
mean?
She was dancing with a cartoon cat and everything. I remember.
Right. And so the fact that NWA displaced Paula Abdul, not at the top of the rap chart, at the top of the pop chart,
Right.
I think made record corporations, not these small mom and pop record outfits that had kind of populated hip hop up until that point. These large corporations realized how much money could be made. And so they
Mm.
kind of come in and start elbowing these smaller companies out of the way because they can't, those budgets, they can't, the budgets
Right.
can't compete. And so, but the larger companies were not necessarily interested in, the artistic integrity of the culture. They were just interested in, oh, what made the most money and how can we replicate that? And
Right.
so, I think a lot of people have been critical about it, hip hop, just because it's felt creatively a little bit mainstream anyway, in a rut for the last 20 or so years because it is focused so much on sex and violence. But hip hop is simply a reflection of society, and hip hop culture is really also a reflection of overall media culture. So hip hop didn't steer us into this, into this rut, an overall media culture about just it being all about TNA and sex and violence. Hip hop was really, in my opinion, just following the lead of mainstream media about what would sell and what would attract the most eyeballs.
But let me ask you this in regards to that, because you do um you do reference, right, that Sir Mix-A-Lot was one of the first rappers to actually, talk about, misogyny and those type of things, and talk about domestic violence, and Macklemore, from this area was also one of the first to actually talk about LGBTQIA plus rights and so forth. And I wonder how much of that is because we didn't necessarily, in Seattle proper, if you will, didn't necessarily have a media infrastructure that was all super supportive, right, of hip hop. Other than, I mean, you had obviously the Rockets started to come up, but I think you even quoted that it was more of rock with, the hip hop, like elements of hip hop within
Mhm.
the magazine. You had the flavor and so forth. But in terms of, right, mainstream, there's I mean, hell, heck, people would still, criticizing Cube 93, the largest quote unquote hip hop and R&B station.
Mhm.
I remember right before I went to college. So I mean, these are, things and battles that have stood the test of time, if you will. So I want to ask how, I guess, without, did maybe not having as much of a robust supportive infrastructure for hip hop locally maybe allow people to feel that they could be a little bit more realer, if you will, and they didn't have to be P Diddy and Mace and the Bad Boy Crew. I mean, no, nah, forget disrespect to them folks, because they didn't kill hip hop in my eyes. But anyway,
Yes, I do think I think it's a combination of what you just said and what you were talking about earlier about with the what we were talking about earlier with the geographical isolation and not feeling pressured. Because so if we think about the three artists who have won Grammys from this area, first would be Sir Mix-a-Lot. And if you, like you just said, and it's talked about in the book, I suppose I should be saying, as I say in the book, I should be saying that more. Um, in that song Posse on Broadway, like you said, there's the crucial sequence of the song where they're up at Dick's on Broadway, which by the way in the video was not filmed at Dick's. In the
right,
video, Dick's did not allow them to shoot anything on their property, even though they were giving them massive free publicity. Dick's was like, no, you can't shoot anything here. They were just, if you notice in the video, they're just, when you see Dick's, they're driving in front of it on Broadway. They're never actually on Dick's property.
right,
But in that video or in that song, he's talking about intervening when a man is about to physically assault his girlfriend. He's talking about using mace to squash the situation. And if you think about the fact that this was 87, 88, that is right at the time when gangster rap was really starting to explode.
right,
Ice-T had already released an album. NWA had released their first album, NWA and the Posse, and then in '88 they released Straight Outta Compton. So gangster rap was really blowing up, and so Mix-a-Lot taking those stands was about as anti-gangster rap as you could get, because gangster rappers, Ice-T was not talking about. In fact, not only was Ice-T not talking about saving a woman from domestic violence, Ice-T was talking about actively beating women down in the street in the song 6 in the Morning. You know what I'm saying? So it was a completely wide gulf between where these artists were coming from and the aesthetic that they were trying to establish. But so that's what I'm saying. Mix-a-Lot doesn't feel like he has to do what they're doing down here in California to be successful. He can do what people do in Seattle and be successful. And so he didn't even win a Grammy for that song. But if you look at Baby I Back, that is a pushback against kind of traditional kind of Western standards of beauty and body style. So he
right,
wins a Grammy for that. And then not, and so he wins a Grammy for that in 1993. In 1994, Diggable Planets. And so Diggable Planets, the leader of Diggable Planets, Ishmael Butler, graduate of Garfield High School. And so on that album, they win the song for the rap Grammy for the Rebirth of Slick, Cool Like That. And on that entire album, they're talking about socialism, and reading Karl Marx, and being insects. And one of them was Butterfly, and one of them was Doodlebug, and the lady in the group was lady was the Ladybug. And so and there was a song on that album called La Femme Fatale, which was a pro-choice anthem. And so there weren't too many rappers in the mid 90s who were talking about pro-choice or talking about Karl Marx or talking about socialism.
right,
So again, that different approach worked in terms of like massive mainstream exposure and response. And then obviously, like you talked about with Macklemore, two of his most famous songs, two of the songs that he rode to popularity, go against two of the most longly held cultural norms of mainstream hip hop. And so he does a thrift shop, which goes against bling, which is, name brand clothing and flashy jewelry. And he does Same Love, which goes against homophobia. And so all those examples of people who were able to achieve, mainstream rap music's highest honor and highest level of recognition, the fact that they were able to do so in ways that were completely unconventional and completely against what everybody else was doing at the time speaks to that isolation and the uniqueness and originality that is bred from that geographic isolation.
Hmm. Thank you. Well, thank you for that answer. So I do want to ask too. With you talk about, and I know this as a writer as well. I feel this, but you talk about sort of the tension within a hip hop artist at of a certain age and of a certain time in Seattle, where it was, do I stay here to be successful, or do I got to leave and go elsewhere to be successful? And I say that as somebody who, even I look at in the writing industry, where you have Ijeoma Luo, who's had been writing forever in Seattle. She she has to get acclaim elsewhere, and then now we love her in Seattle, and several other writers like that. Why is that? One, why is that tension there? And then two, I mean, it seems like it's you don't necessarily answer it in the book, I don't think, but it's more so like this is just something that's ever sort of present. Like, why is that the case here in the city of Seattle?
It speaks to, I think, a portion of that self-esteem issue, and not only really because it's almost like So there's a little piece in the book that talks about Mix-A-Lot, at least maybe there's a quote talking about Mix-A-Lot kind of having trouble getting gigs locally, but being well received in other parts of the country, like the Bay Area. It's kind of in reverse. It's a little bit like, so if you think about E40, this place was very receptive to E40. I mean, it could be argued that Seattle was more receptive to E40 than the Bay Area was when he first started off.
Right.
So I don't think it's completely unheard of or unusual for a local artist who kind of, it's kind of, it's like, it's not like Mix-A-Lot was like ignored, or it's not like he was not well known. But it seemed like you're saying, when he started to get more recognition from outside places, that's when people here started to pay attention to him. When the question should be, well, how come the support, that he got here wasn't the thing that propelled him to success in outside places? And so I think that there's a bit of that here. It makes me think about how in 2015, so in the book, the book basically goes up to about 2015, but it talks about in the book about how the breakthrough for local hip hop, in terms of it being embraced by these kind of venerable local cultural institutions like Mohai and the Northwest Folklife Festival, in 2015, for the first time, Mohai featured an exhibit, the Legacy of Seattle Hip Hop exhibit. And for the first time, so in the Folklife Festival, every year there's a cultural focus within the Folklife Festival. So it's kind of like a festival within the festival. And for the first time in 2015, hip hop was the cultural focus of the Folklife Festival. But talking to people, it was kind of like there was a feeling that was a bit in response to the success of Macklemore. And since there was a rapper, and not just a rapper, but a white rapper who would achieve such staggering levels of success, I have to say that I think that the night of the Grammys, where Macklemore won 4 out of 7 that he was nominated for,
right,
man, has to go down on some level as one of the largest nights in Seattle cultural history. I mean, it's still unbelievable. The guy was nominated for 7. and walked away with 4. Unbelievable, still unbelievable.
And
But
Dr. Abe, I just want to say, it should have been, it should have been 3 because Kendrick Lamar's album, that was fire. I just want to say, it should have
no,
won best.
but you read
Anyway,
that part, right?
I
You
did.
read the part. You read the part where Macklemore apologizes. That's
Yes.
such a Seattle thing to do. I'm sorry I won. I'm sorry. You know what I'm saying? The hip hop thing would have been like, yeah, I won that shit.
Right.
But he was like, I'm sorry I won. So it's such a Seattle thing to do. But
that really was, and I'm glad you included that in there because it was like that really is a Seattle thing. Anyway.
but so yeah, so yeah, the I now I've forgotten what your original question was, but so yeah, so we can see elements of Seattle behavior or Seattle kind of characteristics, you know, even in our hip hop artists, which, you know, again, hip hop is supposed to be the most grandiose, the most braggadocio, the most macho, you know, of all cultures. But, you know, it doesn't have to be like that. And there's room for other energies and other ideologies and other vibes. And I think we do a great job of bringing that to the forefront.
Yeah, I think I was reading actually the other day about, it's the different personality types of cities and how, New York is an alpha type city, and a place like gosh, where is it? Like Minneapolis is more of a beta type city, and we're like an omega city where it's like, why y'all messing with us though? Kind of thing. It's not, but I do want to ask you this because you brought it up earlier about you being of a generation where you thought that hip hop might not endure, and like and I'm slightly younger than you, so I haven't yet gotten an AARP.
You haven't gotten it yet.
No, yeah, no, but but I'm definitely of the generation that even now, right, that kind of takes it for granted that it's an art form like jazz. It'll just be around in perpetuity. And so I want to preface my question by reading a passage. It's on page 129 in your book, and it says, as Trisha Rose once put it, hip hop is a space of Black pleasure. This pleasure is not simply pleasure for pleasure's sake, but a form of resistance. It is a happiness that goes against the imposed miseries of poverty, police corruption, and official and unofficial forms of exploitation. In short, hip hop is a celebration. And so I'm wondering, is that sort of also part and parcel why it was able to endure when, I remember in college reading sort of other histories of hip hop and just being so floored how many people said that, how many critics I should say, that said, oh, this is a flash in the pan, it's not going to continue, yada yada. And and here we still are, right? And it's evolved in a way and continues to evolve. Do you think a part of that is because there is such an emotional, dare I say it, even spiritual connection to it, within communities here?
I think that the connection of the creation of hip hop to this kind of perfect socio-political storm that was happening in the United States in the 1970s, to where what I'm saying is where you have like roughly 10 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And there was tremendous hope during that time in terms of like people expecting life improvement. And then you get 5, 6, 7, 8 years beyond that, and where people's expectations were and where their lives actually are two different things. And so it's difficult to kind of juxtapose that. The connection of hip hop to, like I said, the stories and the feelings of these people who had these predominantly young African American men and women who had never had a form of mass cultural expression before, now have this platform. And I think that that is one of the things that distinguishes it from just about every other musical genre. Maybe in from the United States, I should say. Maybe Jamaica reggae has a kind of a similar connection of socio-political kind of what I'm talking about roots. But in terms of like what was born in the United States, I don't think that there's anything that comes necessarily close to that. And for me, thinking about your question about, okay, so I take the song "The Message" as an example by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. It's released in 1983, and it has got a tremendous beat, and it is one of the all-time, bass lines to dance to. But as you're out there dancing, and it's funky, you're also like, oh, okay, well, I'm listening to a song about rats and roaches and junkies in the alley with a baseball bat. Should I be dancing to this? I don't know. But the duality of that experience is something that I think separates hip hop from just about every other genre, every other kind of form of music. And the fact that it has had its roots in that area, I think, is one of the reasons why it's stuck around so long. I mean,
Was it
I
also
think
about
about
how
I think about Public Enemy, and Public Enemy was like a very focused group on like political issues and, you know what I'm saying, social justice, and, you know what I mean, that
right,
was their thing, and they were like the group in the towards the late 80s and the early 90s. You don't necessarily see that now. I mean, there's still social consciousness in hip hop, but you got to go find it, got to go looking for it a lot more than you used to. But I think that the fact that that kind of foundation and that kind of underlying um, piece, that underlying work, that underlying philosophy, that underlying kind of underdog mentality, and always feeling like, you know, and the willingness to tell your story, the anxiousness to tell your story. Like I said, rap music being about who you are and what it's like where you're from. You know what I mean? Listening to the Ghetto Boys, I pretty much had all the information I needed to know about Houston, Texas.
right.
You know, and so the exchange of information in that way, I feel like, is one of the things that has helped so many people from so many different places, and the crossing of racial and geographic and ethnic and social, socioeconomic lines, that it speaks to struggle. And speaking to struggle, even rich people, I mean, I know it's not the same struggle, but I mean, everybody goes through stuff. And so I'm
Right.
just saying that no matter where you come from, there is an aspect or an element of hip hop that most people can identify with, especially young people.
Do you think it's also how complementary hip hop can be to other musical art forms, right? I mean, I think back even to before it got way overdone with having, an R&B person sing the hook. Remember growing up and listening to, I was in the car with my dad listening to Method Man's "All That I Need," and he had, Mary J. Blige on the hook, and you're like, man, and like,
Mhm.
my dad did not like hip hop at all, and was like, kind of, yeah, this song,
One thing hip hop has always been able to do is bring in music, other types of music, and make it work. You know, when something Africa Bambaataa as a DJ was always famous for was his eccentric taste in music, and being able to like mix in, the the theme from the good, the bad, and the ugly,
right,
over a funky drum beat. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. I mean, whoever would have thought of that? Where did that idea come from? And so just the notion that you can take and make different different sounds from pretty much any genre and make it work within the confines of hip hop, again, is something that we had never seen before in terms of like a musical cultural movement.
well, before I get into a submitted question, let me ask you this, because this is something I've debated with my friends for the last 10 years or so. Is hip hop as we've known it dead? There's obviously there's the album by Nas, is Hip Hop Dead. There's Mos Def and Black Star. Mos Def and Talib Kweli as Black Star did a song about, is it too early to mourn hip hop's demise? Is it too late to rise? What what do you think about it?
I don't think it'll ever be dead. I don't think it can ever die. I think hip hop has that zombie quality to it, that
Mm,
whenever you may think it's going down, watch out, don't turn your back, because it'll probably be getting up again. But I think that the fact that, new elements, new avenues of hip hop, new lanes within hip hop. And so now I'm not just talking about rap, but I'm just talking about the overall kind of uh, all the different aspects of the culture. And so, I mean, these people may be talking about rap when they're saying is hip hop dead. I'm talking about the overall culture. So,
mm,
but in the book, there's towards the end, it talks about a young artist named Young Lennox, and
uh,
Young Lennox, is a kid who grew up with a father who was an old school hip hop fan and had a bunch of albums kind of laying around. And so this kid, Young Lennox, starts doing these crayon renditions of these classic hip hop albums. And I mean, nobody, you know what I'm saying, he has since been invited to show his work at a gallery in New York, and actually had his own showing at a gallery in Los Angeles. That wasn't a lane in hip hop culture. That wasn't something that was established, that, you know what I mean, that a bunch of kids were doing in terms of like crayon drawings of these album covers. That's something that he created. That is a lane that he created. And so I'm just saying that how many other lanes within hip hop that have not been created are there for young people who have this creative urge in whatever aspect of hip hop it may be. And so no, I don't think hip hop's dead, and I don't think hip hop will ever be dead, because it embodies the spirit of struggle, and it embodies the pushback against oppression and giving voice to the voiceless in a lot of ways. I said earlier about how, I mean, what forum before hip hop did young black men and women, maybe young black women had maybe like R&B, and maybe that was a forum where they could be expressive, but there wasn't really that for young black men. And so the fact that people from around the world of varying races and varying social classes saw that this was a forum and this was a platform where you could express yourself, make yourself vulnerable in ways that you wouldn't necessarily outside of that forum, and people would listen. I mean, it's a match made in heaven.
Now, Dr. Abe, you ain't gonna give no love to what's going on era Marvin Gaye. I mean, the brother was kind of expressing himself. I only say that because that's what my father always says when I say.
Okay, I'll give that to him. Yeah, no, you're right.
But
There is
that
space,
was
but
one artist, and he had to fight for that. So
he wasn't that young. You know what I mean? He wasn't a teenager when he was
that's
making that.
true. That's
And
true.
so he was a little bit older. And so I think there was a bit of a generational gap there.
And Barry Gordy wasn't on him as much about keeping it,
Yeah, no. Barry Gordy wasn't having a hot mic ready for for people who wanted to rhyme.
But let me get to a submitter question. It says, so this comes from Jalen. He says, as I read the book, I've been making a YouTube, Spotify playlist out of the works you mentioned, but there's so much that's just not online. How do you put together the parts of the story that happened before recording, streaming technology was widespread?
Um, a lot of time in the library, in the Seattle Library, looking through back issues of the Rocket. Shout out to Seattle Library, Seattle Public Library, the downtown branch, for having that available for me to look through. But also just putting in the work in terms of meeting people and interviewing people. And one of the things that I tried to do in the interviewing process was, at the end, ask the person being interviewed for 2, 3, 4 people that they think I should talk to, and kind of building that research tree out of the people who I had talked to, and having them direct me to the people who they think would be most helpful. And so using kind of a combination of those things and being able to fill in some of those blanks was really great. And I just have to say how grateful I am for how cooperative everybody who I got in touch with was, who I was able to get in touch with was, and sharing their time. And one thing that I have learned, so I actually learned this a little bit. So before this book, there's a book that I did called 6 in the Morning, which is about, it's based on the Ice-T song I was referencing earlier, but it's about basically West Coast kind of California hip hop in the late 80s and early 90s. And there's several interviews with people in there, like Ice-T is interviewed in that book, Young MC is interviewed in that book, Jerry Heller, the former manager of NWA, is interviewed in that book. One of the members of JJ Fad is interviewed in that book. And so what I learned there is I can probably have, when you're talking to people about their glory days, man, you could probably have maybe about 2 or 3 questions wrote down, and they're going to give you a good hour, solid hour of material. Maybe you have a couple follow-ups in there, but man, people love to talk about the glory days, and I love to listen to it. And so that was just a perfect match there. And so there was some of that kind of same dynamic here with this book, and just kind of letting people, just kind of, setting the pins up and letting them knock them down. And you get lots of information and lots of details, because, the reporting, only goes so far in some of these specific details, but people's memories, and especially when you start bringing them back to that time in their lives, really have some great details, and do a great job of just kind of giving information and look, this book had to be shaved down to about a little more than 100,000 words. When the manuscript first got to UW Press, it was closer to probably about 160,000. So we had to shave a lot of details out. You think this book has a lot of details now? Man, you should have saw it when it first got to the press. So we had to shave it down. But the gathering of details is all about, like I said, the combination of speaking to people and finding the best I could, the written records of what people were, what journalists were saying back at that time.
Now, this is extremely richly reported, and I'll say before I get to the last question, because I know we're at the finish line here. I'll say there's just so much that we didn't even get a chance to talk about, from police accountability to some of the local activism here, that how everything sort of paralleled and correlated with the civil rights movement. But I do want to, and I will just say, for everybody who is listening, viewing this should be required reading for every Seattleite. If you are stepping into the city, if you're leaving, exiting out of the city, this should be required reading. So, but with that being said, and then speaking of folks exiting out of the city, not too long ago, maybe a year and a half ago, when we actually could go out to places, I remember going to walking through um, San Francisco, and just thinking about how utilitarian of a place it was. And you went down and visited some of the old haunts and stuff, like City Lights, bookstore, or City Books, I should say, and where all the beatnik artists or whatever used to hang out at. And you hear these stories about how it used to be such a culturally and artistically rich city, and now it isn't that anymore, and that because the artists that have moved out are now. I know you said that hip hop in general, that you're fairly certain will continue to survive and endure. But as somebody who is a lifelong Seattleite, loves it here, loves the artist community here, I ask this from that vantage point of what's do you think hip hop can survive and thrive here in Seattle, or will it be pushed out to the outskirts, like so many of our Black community and communities of color have been?
Yeah, I think that the exodus, if you want to call it that, of Seattle Black people to the outlying areas, primarily in the South, the Rentons, the Kents, the Federal Ways, the Auburns, has certainly had an impact on the artistic balance, specifically the Black artistic balance here in the city. But I think you have a kind of islands of kind of hope and kind of creativity. And like I mentioned, White King, the work he's doing earlier. But then you also have a place like Langston, where Jasmine Scott is doing outstanding work in terms of programming and bringing stuff to there. In fact, I did a thing with Jasmine. We were supposed to do it at Langston, but it was
Right.
COVID time, and so we had to move it somewhere else. But all that kind of stuff is still happening. And you have a place like Wanawari, Inye Wakoma, who has a house, that has been in his family for generations here in the Central District, just a little bit up from where I am, a few blocks up from where I am, which is now this cultural center. And it's literally his house. You know what I mean? I did something up there maybe last fall or spring or summer, and we shot in the living room of the place. You know what I mean? There's a kitchen,
Right.
and when I had to go to the bathroom, you know what I'm saying? There's a bathroom right upstairs. It's literally a house, but he has designated this spot as this kind of island of kind of Black cultural creativity and artistry. And so I think we have those little islands. I mean, I know it's very difficult. You go to 23rd and Union now, and it doesn't even look like the same intersection that it traditionally has. And so 23rd and Jackson. I mean, you can name so many intersections that have undergone so much change and literally don't look anything like they did when we were young.
Right.
But the fact that these community members are actively staking out these spots to make sure that there are these cultural islands that remain, to me, is very encouraging. And I think that that is something that hopefully can continue. I mean, I know it's a battle just in terms of like trying to find space that's affordable and not being developed, and that kind of thing. But I think having a toehold, and it sounds crazy to say Black people having a toehold in the Central District. I mean, that's bananas for me to even be saying that. But really, culturally, in terms of preserving the heritage, that's a big part of it. And so, having that space where we can hang on and possibly build out and increase that toehold, I think it gives me encouragement and makes me feel like that battle against capitalism and development and the precious and the precious nature of land, and every single vacant piece of land people trying to develop here, going back and forth against that kind of community commitment and artistry, and really feeling like putting arts first and culture first, Black arts and Black culture first. These kind of, like I said, small islands give me a lot of hope moving forward.
Right. Hey, well, that's a great place to end it. Dr. Abe, the book is Emerald Street, A History of Hip Hop in Seattle. Everybody needs to go pick it up if you can. Again, like I said, it should be required reading for everybody. Stocking stuffer, we can do Christmas too. I know Christmas isn't until December. We can do Christmas part two. Give it out to as many people as you can. Seriously, thank you again for everything. Is there any, I know you said you don't have a volume 2 coming up anytime soon, but is there any other books that are in the works currently?
Well, first of all, I have a Sharpie, and I will be signing books sometime soon when we're all able to come back together and be close to each other and all that. I already got a Sharpie where I'm ready to start signing.
Well, I heard you a bestseller over at the Sewer Park's Third Place Books. So I mean,
that's where I'll start. I'm going there first.
Okay.
But as far as a next book, well, I told you about how there's this work going on with the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission around raising racial competency amongst police cadets, and also professional development around racial competency for practicing officers, and kind of doing a parallel work with that, with the Academy for Rising Educators, which is basically a partnership between Seattle Public Schools and Seattle Central College to train and certify school teachers, K through 8 school teachers, and having that same kind of level of racial, because an argument that I've heard over the last year, not just over the last year, but it's been amplified over the last years, these institutions such as law enforcement and education were set up in a way to where they are working perfectly in terms of like disenfranchising specific populations. And how can you raise candidates in these areas in this institution when it is working as it was designed to? And I'm saying, I'm not dismissing that. I think there is merit to that, but I'm also saying, okay, what if we train these officers and these teachers in a different way that they haven't been trained before? It's not been that these officers have had to have these critical conversations about the way that they view race and how that impacts how they're going to do their job once they get on the street. Those aren't conversations they've been having during their training. They're at the academy for 5 months. And so the idea of them having this class right along with target practice and defense methods and all of that, let's see what kind of candidates we turn out. In the same way, if we're training teachers and we are training them, in the center of what we're training is anti-racism, anti-racist pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching, and student-centered approach. Let's see what happens when we have candidates emerging back into the schools under that situation. It hasn't really happened before, and we're able to start putting that in place. So I don't know if there's a book in there. There probably is, but right now I'm just kind of in the midst of it. And so there may be a book at some point, but I got to give it a little bit of time just to kind of get both of these programs off the ground and see if we can actually make a difference in this kind of racial and cultural theorizing about how we train both of the members of these gatekeeper occupations, as I call
them. Well, I know there certainly has to be a long magazine article in there.
Well, yeah, we'll have another talk. We'll have another one of these talks on that topic sometime soon.
Well, all right. Well, hey, was Dr. Abe, again, such a pleasure. Thank you for the gift of your time today. And again, just such a wonderful, wonderful book. One of the best that I've read in the last year or so. And yeah,
That's meaningful. Thank you. The pleasure is mine. Thank you.